Chapter 10. Pat glanced around behind him, appearing not to have heard Denton's word at all. Already the stage yard was nearly deserted. Della Follonsbees was nowhere in sight, and it seemed plain that she had had ample time to make her way to the boarding house diagonally across from the station, unmolested, and even unaware that perhaps a disagreeable meeting impended. Since that had been Pat's original purpose in intercepting the cattle dealer, he stepped aside without further ado. "Okay, Denton. I'd feel better if you could be sure you'd carry out your part of that bargain," he remarked pointedly.
"And just what do you mean by that crack?"
Chess chose to retort with increased severity. "Only that I hope, for your sake, that your business affairs just don't happen to conflict with mine."
"And what if they should?"
barked Denton. "Something tells me you got a pretty clear idea of exactly why I'm here," Pat told him levelly. "Perhaps the rest out for yourself, old boy." Chest turned this over and started away in a huff, breathing audibly through his nostrils.
"Still trying to involve me in something that I know nothing about,"
he snorted over his shoulder.
"I wash my hands of it, and you, Stevens."
Standing there, looking after him, Pat made sure that his direction took him away from the boarding house. Beyond this, he did not inquire at the moment further into Denton's activities. "That might have been a mistake," he murmured ponderingly. "It seemed worthwhile to keep that girl from being bothered, and there's just a chance, now he knows we're on the ground, that Denton will be sense enough to leave her strictly alone."
"Question is, though, what's she doing up here?"
Ezra put in shrewdly.
"Kinda sudden, isn't it?"
Pat's brows knit. "I've been asking myself that myself," he admitted. "Does seem a tad strange, since she knows I've come here to scout around for this Vern Hunter. Maybe she learned something herself since I've left."
"Aiming to talk to her?"
"Well, I really haven't anything to tell her." Pat appeared undecided. "She's her own boss, Ezra, but I'm a bit surprised for a moment. I didn't even notice whether she brought the boy along with her."
"That young rip in the flashy cowboy rig?"
Ezra nodded.
"I saw him."
Pat frowned at that. "She could be planning to move up here, though I don't see how she could without abandoning the pitchstone for good. On the other hand, I can savvy her unwillingness to leave Bobby anywhere, though. She wants him right under her eye, especially now."
"You mean—"
Pat nodded. It was grim. "It'd be a swell way for some yellow hombres to put pressure on her if they had that boy." Ezra's jaws bulged with indignation at the other's suggestion. He said nothing, but his stubborn mind was busy. He was still in a brown study when they started to move away. Before they'd gone 100 yards, Pat found the big fella hanging back.
"You go on and grab some rest,"
urged Ezra gruffly when Stevens turned to him to inquire.
"I'll hang around the boarding house here and keep watch just in case."
Pat grinned, reading the direction of the one-eyed giant's thoughts. "Not a bad plan at that. We'll both stick here for a wee while," he proposed.
"No, go on. You go get your sleep, and you can come back if you insist."
It was so arranged. Pat turned in at the boarding room, where they had arranged quarters, setting the silent alarm clock which he carried in his head. It aroused him as usual, sharp on the dot of 2 a.m. Letting himself out quietly, he went to relieve Ezra, who he found at his post, faithfully prowling about the exterior of the boarding house. "All quiet?" Pat greeted him in an undertone.
"Nothing stirring," reported Ezra dourly. "I'm beginning to believe I'm imagining things."
"I'll go on and hit the feathers," Pat urged. "I'll watch for a while." But instead, Ezra joined him in a cup of coffee at an all-night hash house, and by 3 o'clock the pair were still scouting the silent boarding house, quietly discussing Ches Denton's possible interest in Del Follonsbees without getting anywhere.
"Shucks,"
Ezra growled at last.
"We're wasting our time here tonight, Pat. Whatever his game is, Denton ain't made up his mind yet on his next move. Come on, let's turn in and get some shut-eye while we still got us a chance."
The advice seemed sound, and after a moment's hesitation, Pat acquiesced. Back in their room, they crawled into bed and were soon sound asleep. They were still dead to the world an hour after sunrise when Ezra unaccountably began dreaming that he had gone to sleep with one foot thrust out a window, and for some reason it appeared to be caught, and he couldn't quite yank it back, although perfectly aware that the birds were pecking at his toes. Finally, the coldness of that exposure made him sneeze violently, and the shock awoke him in a flash. Sam Stallone, letting himself into the room while Pat and Ezra were asleep, had uncovered one of the latter's feet and was holding it aloft, tickling it with a devilish persistence. Roaring with disgust, Ezra sat up violently in his bed, disheveled and grumpy, and glared at the little man.
"Back, are you?"
he rumbled, as if finding the knowledge heavily distasteful.
"How come?"
Rolling over onto his side and grinning, Stevens likewise awaited the answer. Sam shrugged easily. "Avalanche is an all-night town. I did all I could do up there and then grabbed the next stage back." They could find no legitimate complaint with this. "What about Vern Hunter, Sam?" asked Pat. "I suppose that you remembered to inquire about him."
"Yeah, Hunter. Well, it's—"
Sam fumbled for words, appearing somewhat puzzled.
"It's funny, Pat, but I couldn't get no real line on that hombre. He's knowed up there all right, by reputation. Not any well too liked, though. I heard one or two stories about Hunter's sharp practice, but I didn't run into nobody who'd admit knowing him personal. Seems as if—"
His voice faded with intensity of his thinking. "In short, all the talk about him was pretty cagey. Is that about the size of her?" Pat summed up for him. Stallone looked up quickly.
"Well, that's exactly it," he exclaimed. "Only thing I learnt for certain is that Hunter ain't an Avalanche now wherever he is."
"Any rumor to the effect that Hunter might have been knocked off?" Pat persisted. Stallone shook his head. Certainly he hadn't received that impression from anything he'd heard in the mining town.
"Seems kind of more like the opposite, if you know what I mean," he returned thoughtfully.
"Huh."
Ezra was painfully scornful of his partner's sketchy information.
"You started up there full of beans there, half-pint. But from all I heard you say about Hunter so far, I take it you decided to leave his dog behind this time."
"Why, Sam didn't do so bad," interrupted Pat, before the inevitable wrangle could get started. "I seem to get a picture of Hunter as a downright shady feller, with any number of irons in the fire. A man who prefers to work quietly with as little publicity as possible."
"I got that too," growled Ezra. "Which is more'n Sam did. Question is, are them cautious gents afraid Hunter will come back to Avalanche to their sorrow, or are they covering up for him?"
Pat pretended mild surprise. "Oh, you got that, did you?" He chuckled in approval, only to fall sober again swiftly. "Never mind, Sam. You picked up enough to satisfy me that it's worth our while digging deeper into this setup there in Avalanche. At first, I was afraid we'd come all this way here only to find Hunter was snuffed out. And now, for some reason, I don't think so at all. I'm not sure just why, though. What kind of town is Avalanche, Sam?" Stallone described a typical mountain mining town. Avalanche was larger than Sundance, larger, in fact, than most towns that they had accustomed to frequenting. It was, moreover, just now, in an unusual state of turmoil. During the short space of his sojourn there, Sam had easily detected a nervous tension boiling at no great distance below the surface. His knack for fretting out information had soon armed him with the knowledge that the supply merchants of Avalanche were locked in a fierce struggle with the powerful owners of Big Medicine, a mining camp laying some miles above the foothills.
As I get it, the storekeepers think the big mines are trying to bypass them on profits, while the miners are yelling gouge. There's been some freight line stoppages, and drivers are getting shot, and it's general all-around hell.
In short, just about the same state of affairs as exists in every mining camp. Pat grinned. Big money squandering around, and everyone in an almighty scramble after it. Just how, he continued slowly, would a gent like Hunter fit into such a setup? Sam's surprise was real.
Dang it, Stevens! You done took the words out of my mouth. A place like Avalanche should be duck soup for Hunter's kind, if I read 'em right, but...
He hesitated.
I thought Vern Hunter turned out a good egg, who'd maybe help Della if he could.
Pat's headshake was quizzical. Not necessarily, Sam. Reckon I thought so myself at first, he conceded levelly. But we'll take Hunter as we find him. That is, when we do. Good idea, Ezra allowed gloomily. A long training and hard experience had taught him not to expect much of men in general. Be better all around if Del Follonsbees prepared herself to take Hunter with a grain of salt. Reckon she thinks once he's found all her troubles are solved. Pat laughed grimly. Queer I should get the idea that when they meet, that's when her troubles really start.
How could that be?
Asked Sam blankly.
She's a plumb long ways from here.
No, she ain't, brother. They told him about the girl's arrival in Sundance and the adventures with Denton. Sam took it with twitching nostrils, striving to fit these events into a logical pattern. Will she go on to Avalanche Day? Ezra asked. Pat shook his head dubiously. I know you're waiting for me to have a talk with her, but in a way, it might be a good idea just to keep watch on her for a while and just see what turns up. You mean use her for bait? Began Ezra craftily. Pat eyed him thoughtfully. It would save us trailing a raft of these hombres.
Speaking of that, Sam spoke up. I ran into Denton's black-headed friend aboard the stage. He seems to be holding authority with the line. Maybe in charge of stock or something. I had a talk with him. What kind of blackleg did he turn out to be? Growled Ezra. Why, he ain't. Sam's defense was quick. Seemed like a mighty decent feller, Ezra. Danged if I didn't near forget myself gassing with him. Same thing happens when you get talking to yourself, Ezra said crabbedly. He looked across at Pat. So what's the deal, Stevens? We're forgetting about this Hunter while we watch Dell? No, not at all, Pat considered deliberately. Watching the girl is a job I'll hand over to you two, he said quietly, while I smoke out Hunter in a hurry. You sure of that, are ya? Bristled Sam. At least I got a plan. Seems as if Hunter could be smoked into the open, if we could do it right. Okay, spit it out then, Ezra challenged. It's simple. Pat smiled easily. I'll just drift up to Avalanche, pretending to be Hunter himself. If people don't know the difference, there's no great harm done, and if they do, Hunter should soon put an appearance to see what goes. Silently, they weighed the potentials of this plan. It was typical of both the crusty partners that were quick to see its worst features. Hold on, Ezra grumbled. Your scheme sounds like a quick way to get yourself knocked off, Stevens. How do you know how many enemies this here Hunter's got up there?
Well, sometimes a man enemies know more about his movements than his friends. Pat smiled.
Sloane shook his head stoutly. I don't like it at all. Ain't there some other way of getting at this hombre?
Their frank disapproval appeared only to confirm Pat in his fixed purpose. He swung out of bed and began briskly to dress. Maybe I shake a leg I can catch that morning stage. He was cheerful, beaming on his gloomy friends.
Dang ya!
Ezra burst forth.
Ain't no holding you with the prospect of risk in sight, is there?
Are you wishing to go in my place, there is? Retorted Pat, with a faintly edged satire. He could not silence the big fellow thus easily, but nothing that Ezra found to say had power to dissuade Stevens from his undertaking. Ready a few minutes later, he caught up his hat and turned towards the door.
Why don't we see you? Sloane demanded testily. Is this it? Is this all we do?
Pat chuckled. If Dell decides to come on to Avalanche, you may see me again sooner than you expect. I'm trusting you two to pry that girl away from any real trouble that happens to bother her, he reminded them soberly. And that means anybody at all.
You,
Ezra told them with directness,
you tend to your own schemes. Just don't expect one of us to come boiling up there and bailing you out of your grief is all.
Pat pretended to scan him admiringly. I don't know how I'd ever manage to stand you, he murmured, if you weren't at least consistent. Just a perpetual creep-hanger. With that, he was gone, easing the door shut behind him to cut off the lanky redhead's bellow of exasperation. Making for the stage station without delay, he learned that, with 20 minutes to spare, he had time for a hasty bite to eat. After grabbing a scant breakfast, he sauntered back up the street with a toothpick between his teeth. The stagecoach was standing before the station, still minus its teams. With 5 minutes at his disposal, Pat glanced toward the boarding house. It occurred to him that, with luck, he might possibly pick up a clue to Della's plans before leaving Sundance. It was at least worth a try. With this purpose in view, he made for the door of the side porch, intending to step through to the office and check the register. This door gave upon a parlor, and he saw as he let himself in with a wide double door beyond opening into the office of the front. The first sound he heard in this place was a crisp, womanly voice out there, and the boisterous response of a child. Pat froze in his tracks, gazing towards the flimsily curtained doorway, aware that it was Della Follonsbees who he had heard. The girl was thanking someone else unseen for the comforts and accommodations of the night. Cocking his head, Pat knew by this that Della was leaving. Nor was he mistaken. She completed the payment of her bill and a moment later turned to head for the front door. At a distance of perhaps 15 feet, Pat watched her pass the opening between office and parlor. And had she turned, she must have seen him as well, but she did not. With her small brother's fist firmly clasped in hers, she passed on out the door, carrying a carpet bag with her. Uh-oh, she's going to be aboard that stage, Pat thought. Turning, on tiptoe, he moved back to the side door and let himself out as quietly as possible. He waited at the corner of the porch till he saw Della and the boy climbing into the stage. A scrutiny of the street brought to his notice no sign of Ches Denton or anyone else who might have taken the slightest interest in the girl. But as he moved slowly forward, watching the salty teams being harnessed to the vehicle, the black-haired man who he had seen with Denton stepped briskly out of the stage office, and Pat's eyes slit. Was this Denton's way of keeping a close surveillance over Della's move? At first glance, the night before, Stevens had rather taken to this young fellow as far as appearance had concerned, but that might mean nothing at all when the chips were down. Certainly, the black-headed one would be watching until it was clear where and how he fit into the picture. But if Pat had expected the other to climb into the coach with the girl, he was forced to revise his estimate. Instead, the young fella swung up on the wheel and clambered to the driver's high seat, where he grabbed for the reins with practiced ease. Ready to roll, he glanced around as Pat smoothly followed him, unseen by the girl, and reached the seat and nodding an offhand greeting. "I'd gather the sunshine with you this morning, if you don't mind." Sharp-eyed, but pleasant enough of manner, the black-headed driver assented without demur. "Suit yourself, mister, if you're a customer, as you seem to be," he returned quietly. Picking up the reins, he released the brakes, and the stage clattered out into the street on its way to Avalanche. End of Chapter 10.